Despite all her raving, screaming and ranting, James has so far stood still and silent behind Shida, watching the situation unfold while keeping his thoughts and judgments to himself. However, now he suddenly came into motion. Still as well as before, he quickly stepped forward, swiftly bringing his body in between Shida and the captain, while extending his organic arm defensively. Although they didn't have the capacity or inclination to react to it at the time, both Shida and Uton were surprised by his sudden actions, as the human shoulder pressed up against Shida's chest, while his dark eyes locked with those of the much larger primate in front of him. Shida stared at him, his wide frame barely allowing her to see past him to look at the captain. She also couldn't see his face, only the pitch-black hair on the back of his head. But Uton was looking at his face with just as much confusion as Shida had felt at first. Confusion that was quickly consumed by the smouldering rage that was still quietly gaining intensity within her. "What are you doing?" she could hear herself asking James, almost sinisterly, as the building tension in her mind and body searched for any kind of release it could find. "Keeping you from doing something you'll regret," James answered tonelessly, without looking back at her. His face remained locked at the captain. A hissing exhale escaped through Shida's teeth. Regret? She was regretting a lot of things. You could almost say she was getting quite good at it at this point. And she was fairly certain this wouldn't be one of those things. "Step aside, James," she ordered him, not fully expecting it to work, although she hoped that the glumness in her voice would be enough to move him, if his conscience wasn't. But James didn't budge. He just quietly shook his head without looking back at her. Shida annoyedly clicked her tongue. "Can't even look me in the eyes?" she asked aggressively, her irritation at him standing in between her and the object of her ire ever growing. She would have expected for him to at least hesitate when he noticed her anger slowly shift onto him, whether she wanted it to or not. But to her surprise, James just scoffed in humorless amusement, and shook his head once more. "I'm not showing Uton my back again," he stated coldly. And although Shida couldn't see his face, something in his expression must have changed, because Uton's eyes looked like they'd just seen a violent crime unfold in front of them, while they stared at their fellow primate, even if he only saw a projection of it. To Shida, his back was completely exposed while he held his organic arm protectively outstretched. But towards his front, his mechanical hand was raised defensively, tensing up in an angle as if ready to strike at a moment's notice. And his eyes remained fixated on the captain's dark face, taking up most of his attention. If Shida wanted to get past him, there was no doubt that she'd be able to, and they both knew that. Yet he seemed to fully trust that no matter how angry she had gotten here, she would not go through him to get to her target. If asked directly, Shida wouldn't have known if she would have had that same trust in herself as well. But seeing it so freely extended to her almost immediately brought an urge with it not to break it immediately. Still, that didn't mean she wouldn't still try to get what she wanted, her instincts urging her to not give up so easily, as her perceived prey stood right in front of her now. "Then why are you protecting him?" she asked James. Seeing as he didn't trust Uton enough to even slightly turn his head in his presence, he couldn't care about his safety all that much. In a translation of which she didn't know if it was genuine or meant to copy mere mannerisms, James also clicked his lips in disregard. "I'm not, and you know that," he replied firmly, his gaze ever so slightly shifting away from the captain and towards the distance. "I'd love to just let you do as you please here. It's your life he's ruined. Were it up to me, you could make him pay the price for it, but it's not. And we aren't above consequences. I don't care if you hurt him, but I won't just let you hurt yourself." Shida exhaled slowly while she felt some tension build up in her jaws again. What? So now he wanted to tell her what to do as well? "Ruined!" Uton suddenly blurted out. It wasn't quite clear if he was simply emboldened by James forming a physical barrier in between him and Shida, or if he was truly so offended by that statement that he couldn't help but speak out despite his clear fearfulness. But it almost seemed like the second option was more likely. "I ruined her life. Look what you've done to her. Look at her. Look at her face. There wasn't a mark on her when I watched over her. I took her under my wing, and she had been climbing in the ranks for years. I taught her everything I know, and you have the gall to tell her I ruined her life? After she worked so hard to get where she was." James's eye immediately snapped back onto the captain, and Shida's focus was pulled entirely to her surrogate father once again. James opened his mouth to say something, but Shida was faster. To her own surprise, she watched herself put a hand on James's neck to push him aside, with as gentle of a force as she could muster, clearing up the way between her and Uton so she could stare him down herself. James stumbled a single step before catching himself again, briefly glancing back at her, clearly ready to immediately step in again, should he deem it necessary. But Shida just took one step forward, so she would stand next to him before stopping again. It wasn't that she was any less angry now than she had been before. Far from it, in fact. But something had clicked for her. Uton had talked big about understanding earlier, and he was right. Understanding was important, and she realized that no matter what she was going to do from now on, it was important that the captain understood exactly why it was going to happen. "It's a scratch," she exclaimed, before she'd even finished her one step forward, and gestured towards the scars on her face. "It's not a big deal. Stop pretending like it matters to you at all." Uton's face hardened as the large man swallowed heavily, apparently steeling himself in preparation to stand his ground here. "It's not about the scratch," he said, his deep voice quivering slightly as he spoke. "It's about what it represents. All the training, all your years of work, I can't bear to see you like this. Don't you remember? You wanted a different life, wanted out of all of this. You wanted to be better, you worked so hard, and for what? To toss it all away?" Shida took a deep breath. Meanwhile, James took a close look at her face, seemingly contemplating for a second before letting his, so far still raised left arm, sink down again, taking back up his previous passive position once more. "I admired you so much," Uton suddenly admitted, causing her to pause, holding her breath. "Back then, when you were presented to me, when I saw you for the first time and you stood there in front of me, you were still so young, so unkempt, neglected and left to fend for yourself by your people. But you had worked too hard to be where you stood. Still so young, but already you had fought so much, just for a chance to be better. Just for a chance to be more than your people had allowed you to be. You asked me why I chose you? How could I have turned you away when whenever I looked at you, I saw the future?" The breath she had been holding to be ready to retort something escaped Shida through her teeth. She could see it in his eyes. Everything that Uton was saying right now, no matter how unbelievable it sounded, given everything she knew, was true. Or at least, he seemed to believe it was. "Of course, you were a bit rough around the edges," Uton continued on, since nobody seemed to be interrupting him. "Wilder than my usual cadets, energetic and explosive, and of course a lot more dangerous. I remember those first months well, you know, back when I was still getting to know you. You moved without a sound, you heard me coming from multiple rooms away, you shrugged off jumping from the highest places the ship had to offer. And of course you were quick to flash your teeth and claws when things didn't go your way. But in time I learned to look past that. Look past all the muscles and bones and teeth and claws to see what lies beneath. And I saw that you weren't different at all. What did strength and claws matter to a person? It was all about how we are. It doesn't matter what we are." For a moment, Shida didn't know what to say. Uton still seemed to be genuine. It didn't seem like he was just trying to tell her what she wanted to hear. And what he said there sounded so much like the very things herself and James were trying to achieve. But if he really believed that, then how could he have ever gone along with all of that? But while she was still stunned, torn in between anger and disbelief, James couldn't keep to himself, and he scoffed at Uton's words with so much contempt that it sent icy shivers down her back that even pierced through all her anger. "Of course it fucking matters," he stated, with both utter scorn and deathly certainty in his voice. "How can you have the right idea and still get it so awfully wrong?" Uton shook his head, saddened. "I would have expected you to understand," he admitted outright, and inadvertently raised one of his massive hands to start grabbing away at the fur of his head. "You seemed to get it back then, you know. When we talked, when I watched you, I thought, this is someone who understands. Herbivores, carnivores, Deathworlders or not, you didn't care. Even when faced with our ship's very own, and, forgive my phrasing for a moment, abomination, you didn't hesitate. It gave me so much hope back then. But little did I know that you were merely just like them." Uton's eyes noticeably fixated on James's mechanical arm for a moment. She'd expected James to get angry at that, however it seemed to have the opposite effect. "I'm nothing like Curie," James replied, and he almost proudly lifted his mechanical hand to look down at it with a wistful expression. "We're both cyborgs, yes, but I became one out of necessity. Just getting this one arm nearly broke me at first. Curie wanted all their enhancements, and they're happy as can be with them." James then clenched his robotic hand into a fist, and looked back up at Uton firmly. And this arm won't let me survive an explosion or shock of gunshots like they can. However, at this point, Curie can't even eat solid food anymore, so they follow a very strict diet, while I survive off of whatever is available. You can't treat us the same, he kept on explaining, spreading his arms out as he spoke. Same for the two of us. We're both primates, but I can run on 2 legs and handle nearly thrice the gravity you can. But you can still effortlessly climb up constructs that I'd slide off of without a chance. What about Shida? We're both high-class Deathworld predators, and our species even almost looks the same, but we're still nothing alike. I needed a chaperone in quarantine so I wouldn't go stir crazy from being alone for so long, while me'd have to basically be forced to be around other people after a while. You simply can't treat us the same. His expression then turned unapologetically serious again, as he glared right into Uton's eyes. When Shida left the GES, she was atrophied. Her muscles were weak, and her stamina stunted because her body simply hadn't been taken care of the right way, and she didn't even remember that it wasn't supposed to be like that. I can only pray that, after years of that, the damages it left behind will be handleable in the future. But if it had gone on for much longer, I don't think it would have ended well for her, he finished in a grim tone. We should judge each other based on our deeds, not our natures. You're not wrong there, but what we are matters. Because no, everyone is not the same, and everyone deserves to be treated appropriately. Because if we aren't, we will wither. One way or another, it will break us. Shida took another deep breath, feeling her body slightly shiver as endorphins in her bloodstream were starting to break down. You said that when you first met me, you admired me. She repeated the captain's earlier words back at him. Well, back then I admired you too. What I worked so hard for, it was nothing. I just wanted to get out of poverty and destitute without stooping to criminality. I knew I'd have to endure shitty work with people that hated me, but if it meant getting out of the cramps, it was still better than what I had. So, when I was introduced to my potential new captain, I didn't exactly have high hopes, but when you arrived, you treated me like a person. Among the hundreds of people I'd met in my life, you were the first one to not see an abandoned brat or a fearsome Deathworlder. That by itself wasn't exactly a warm welcome, but it was a welcome. And with you encouraging me, I started looking further into the future, looking at things I could do. You always tried to keep me on the right track, and I started to think, when I have my own ship someday, I can be like that as well. I can make a ship where everyone is welcome. Ever since then, I wanted to be a captain as well. Shida felt herself welling up. She couldn't physically cry from emotion alone, not like humans could, but she still felt her blood rush into her face and eyes as she spoke, making her face feel like it was burning up. Nothing would have made me happier, Uton said in his gravelly voice, but Shida quickly raised a hand to silence him, as she needed a moment to collect her words while emotion and memory overwhelmed her. But, she said, choking back an uncontrolled quiver in her voice before glaring up at the captain, with eyes that must have been red at this point, if the way they burned was anything to go by. But I've given you too much credit. I see it now. I thought you were good to me because everything I knew before you was worse. Now all I want is to be better than you. It seemed that her words were effective. At the very least, Uton could not hold her gaze anymore, and quickly looked away. I still don't know if you've ever cared, but it doesn't matter, Shida continued darkly. I don't care about your intentions anymore. I don't care about your best wished anymore. I don't care what you say. I don't care what you thought. The only thing I care about now is what you did. Slowly, her claws extended from the tips of her fingers and her hair once again started to stand, although this time she could not feel the same fire from before burn within her. It had left only ashes behind, ashes of what had once been her bond to the man before her. It had been burned away completely. James, hold me back, she suddenly yelped, and James was immediately at her side. She didn't really care about consequences to herself, but she couldn't make any more trouble for everyone else. That man simply wasn't worth it. James held her tightly, and brought his mouth close to her ear. I think we should go, he whispered, and Shida tightly gripped his mechanical arm, knowing she couldn't hurt it an accident. Her knuckles turned white as she pressed down on it. One more thing, Shida said tonelessly, and gave one last piercing stare that seemed to almost force Uton to face it, without being able to look away anymore. This isn't over. You hurt the people I thought you were. They're people who really treated me like a person, who really care, and I won't forgive you. You do well to remember that. Uton's face turned blank, and if he could, Shida was sure he would have turned pale as well. It seemed that some life had simply been drained from him, and he immediately seemed to age a few more years as more wrinkles started to form around his face almost instantly. But Shida couldn't look at it for long, because James was already turning her around and moving her the first few steps towards the door. Then he made a quick gesture with his organic hand, which caused one of the masked figures guarding the door to quickly hurry over to the two of them. At James's wordless request, Amir put his arm around Shida and started to guide her further towards the door, while James momentarily stopped in the middle of the room, turning to face its other occupants. While letting herself be guided away, Shida turned her head to watch her boyfriend as he casually began to unholster the pistol that was strapped to his hip, keeping the weapon in his hand, but pointed at the ground as he spoke up again. "You don't have to stay with him," he said, the projected eyes of his mask focusing onto Sky, who had seemingly been coerced into silence by the intensity of the previous conversation for a bit. Now being directly addressed, the girl seemed to need a moment to find her voice again, and her head and ears briefly fluttered as she regained her focus on the here and now. "You can come with us right now. There's nothing he can do to stop you," James further assured the girl, making a very brief gesture with his gun to indicate that he would be willing to defend that right of hers if he had to. "I didn't want to leave you behind the last time. I'm not doing it again." Sky looked at the man, and at the weapon in his hand. She also briefly glanced over at Uton. "Is that an order then?" she asked, once again staring at the gun. James tilted his head surprisedly, and then shook it. "It's your choice," he said, although it was obvious from his voice that he was confused that the Ketsir would even consider the option of staying with the captain, against her will. Sky seemed to seriously think about it for a bit, slowly stroking through the fur on her face with a hand. Then finally, she seemed to have decided. "I think I'll stay with him," she stated, nodding over to the captain. James seemingly needed to hold back a certain amount of irritation, indicated by a slight quiver of his hands. But why? Was all he could ask at that, even as he already holstered his gun once more. "You heard us. He's just going to do it all over again, with you this time." Sky shrugged. "Feels right," she said, clearing up exactly nothing. It seemed to do nothing to quell James's irritation, but Shida was surprised to feel a slight smile on her own face. That girl. "I can't guarantee for your safety if you go with them," James admitted, while leaving his shoulders hanging, although he was clearly getting ready to also turn and leave without arguing his point further. "Don't have to," Sky confidently replied. "That's his job." As she nodded towards Uton, using her large antlers to point to the primate. James nodded, first hesitantly, then more earnestly. "Best of luck then," he said, clearly not happy with her decision, but still respecting it. Then his attention was turned onto Uton one last time. "Any harm that comes to her, I will repay you tenfold." The threat was a promise, that much was clear. With that, James turned on his heels and took a single step towards the exit, before suddenly pausing again as if he had been glued in place. The projection of his face lit up as if he had just had a brilliant idea that caused him to immediately turn around again. "Oh, and Captain, I just remembered that there should still be some of our property on board of your ship. Surely you wouldn't mind if we came by to get it, right?" It was possible that Uton replied something. However, Shida didn't hear it anymore, because at that moment, she was brought out to the bar's door, and it was immediately closed behind them. "You okay?" Admir asked her, almost as soon as they were separated from the people on the inside by the metal divider. Meanwhile, the rest of the team, who had waited on the outside, already moved to group back up with them. "I still feel like I want to tear his throat out," Shida admitted, with a relaxing exhale that released some of the remaining tension from her body. "But yeah, I'm doing much better now." "There were too many witnesses anyway," Admir laughed, and gave her a forceful clap on the shoulder. "Hope you at least gave him a proper earful," Tuya said, not quite as enthusiastically as Admir was, but still in seemingly high spirits. She was probably eager to get some details after she had had to wait outside during the encounter. "Not only that," she'd replied, and ran her hand through her hair to flatten it out again after it had been standing so much during the exchange. "I made him a promise. This isn't over." The projection of Tuya's face on her mask turned to confusion for a moment, but before she could ask for clarification, the door behind them already opened again, as James and Andres made their way outside as well. "I hope that girl knows what she's doing," Andres said, and James could only groan exasperatedly. "No idea what's going on in her head, but even if I wanted to, I couldn't force her to leave with us," he said, running through his hair with both of his hands before folding them behind his head, and then pulling down towards his neck until they separated again. From the other side, Sam took a few sauntering steps towards them, clearly intent on addressing those two directly. "So, what now then?" she asked, shifting most of her weight onto one of her legs. To which Andres replied, "Seems like we're visiting the Dock 37. Apparently these two still have some stuff to get back." The travel to the dock was as mundane as any travel appeared to be these days. Sure, at first it took some getting used to from being among a varied crowd of differing species again, after spending some time in a very isolated population. However, since the small group of Deathworlders could stick mostly to themselves on the walkway specifically designed for people of their own size, and since none of them especially felt like sightseeing at the time, they barely had to interact with anyone, and quickly returned to the shuttle which, after some organising, shipped them over to the dock floating not far from the station. As they approached, James and Shida took a brief glance outside of the shuttle's front window to see the old expedition ship sticking slightly out of the floating ring on both sides. Once inside, they moved past all the different dock workers busy with refueling and resupplying the vessel, and beelined it to the ramp that extended to the ship, which was hovering ominously above them from the middle of the massive structure. After spending a long time on a planet, the tricks of artificial gravity, like for example walking up a spiral at an incline, and completing multiple rotations in the process before you reach your goal, did mess with the mind a bit. But it was nothing that wasn't quickly rectified once memory of having done things like this before set in. As they walked further and further towards the centre of the rotation, gravity also got weaker and weaker. Since the ship's spin can only sink to the much larger dock, its gravity was most likely somewhere around half a standard, or just 1/6 of Dunama's or Earth's gravity. Shida remembered walking up and down this ramp before, and it had never taken her this much effort to remain rooted to the ground. And she wasn't the only one. Around her it seemed the human soldiers had a particularly hard time adapting to a gravity that was this enormously weaker than anything they were generally used to. "Man, I never thought I'd see this hallway again," James admitted with some awe in his voice, as he finally stumbled out of the ramp and aboard the ship proper. Shida stopped as she followed after him, feeling her body freeze up as her brain processed the images her eyes were seeing. The high ceiling, the grey tile floor, the plain walls, that had an alcove a bit above the height of her head for any crew members that might be too small to safely use the normal walkways. It was all exactly how she remembered it. "What a dump," a voice to her side suddenly said, ripping her out of her stunned state. Apparently, Tuya was not very impressed with her former home. "Yeah, I also like our song a hell of a lot more," Amit concurred, while looking along the empty hallways. "Hey now," Andres chimed in disapprovingly. "We're not here to judge interior design, we're here to pack our shit and leave." He then turned his head slightly to look at James. "Lead the way, Lieutenant," he said, to which James seemingly rolled his eyes. At least that's what it looked like when he slightly moved his head, and the eyes of his projected face briefly glitched for a second. "Honestly, I'm not all that attached to most of the stuff," he admitted, while swinging the empty bag he had brought with him for the sake of transport over his shoulder. "But it didn't feel right to leave it here." And with that, he began to walk down the hall, very carefully so he wouldn't accidentally jump all over the place. Shida wondered if he even still knew the way. He had spent so little time here. Of course, she still remembered. She remembered every corner of this ship like the back of her hand. Every corner they passed caught her attention, flooding her mind with memories of what lay behind every path they didn't take. There was the way to electrical, where she had taken Curie to sneak into their destroyed lab. Had they fixed it by now? There was the way to the fitness room, from where they had stalked Reprique's back when they still knew little about him. Would her weight still be there? A turn ahead would lead to cargo, where she had hidden after her and James's first encounter. Those crates had probably been emptied for a long time. If they followed this way a bit further, they would soon find medical, where she had first gotten out of her quarantine a little less than a uniform year ago. Was anyone being held there right now? Just waiting for their time to get out? And now, there were of course the cabins. "Whoa! This thing is still reacting to me?" James exclaimed surprisedly, as the pneumatic gate to cabin number 120 loudly hissed and cracked, once he had brought his hand down onto its biotechnical sensor. I guess I've never been officially fired, huh? Shit. Does this mean I still get my salary? The mechanical door opened wide, its interlocking parts disengaging and moving aside to grant them entrance into the long, untouched room. There was a very faint, even to Shida, almost inaudible impact of wood on tile a moment later, and Shida looked down astonished, as a small object gently bounced on the floor in the low gravity, before slowly settling down and rolling towards her feet. She bent down and picked it up. It was one broken half of a pointed wooden twig. Behind her, glasses were curiously cast onto the object that she now gently rotated in between two fingers. A toothpick? Tuya asked after a moment of contemplation, and the word made James shoot around on the spot. No way! He cried out excitedly, and took a look at the small object himself. Shida slowly nodded. Yes, Way, she said in slow thoughtfulness. Nobody's been in here all this time. James kept on staring in amazement, but Admir behind him shrugged. That's where they figured out the trick, he said, apparently trying to slightly curb everyone's enthusiasm. But no, that made no sense. They wouldn't have bothered to set it up again, not with the both of them gone. Well, it certainly looks like this is how you left it, Andres said, having sauntered into the room while everyone else was busy getting excited over a wooden stick. Deceleration protocol? He pointed towards all the furniture that had been strapped down and closed shut, with a number of chains, belts, and locks. Yeah, James confirmed, and now also walked into his old room. Shida followed after him. The first thing she saw was the large bed straight ahead of her. She could almost see herself, tossing herself into the sheets with wild abandon, and undoing all of the work James had done making the darn thing. Then the picture changed, and it was instead her standing in front of it, looking down unsurely, while James waited in the sheets for her to decide if she would get in or not. What happened here? Sam asked after a moment, and looked up at the white sheet hung up on the wall, covering what used to be the computer terminal of this cabin. Broke it, James replied nonchalantly, as he unlocked the chain that was keeping his closet locked shut. There was a camera in there, so he smashed it. Ah, Sam responded, just as nonchalantly, and folded her arms. What James didn't mention was that it got the both of them sentenced to a torture session, with less lethal stopping weapons. Meanwhile, he was busy tossing everything he still had stored in that closet into his bag, without much care for any of it. Finally, he stood up. I think that's it for me, he said, his obscure face turning towards Shida. Anything still in your room, treasure? Shida hadn't really listened, or even thought much about it for that matter. Anything that she had left behind she had already considered lost. Maybe some clothes, she mumbled, scratching her ear. Nothing important. Well, we're already here, Tuya said with a shrug, and turned back towards the door. Might as well get them. Maybe we should call the others and ask them if they want anything back as well, James then mused, while carrying his bag out the door. Shida briefly stopped once she reached the gate, and ran a hand across the wall next to it, realizing that this time, she probably really would never see this again. Yeah, she mumbled. Different from James's room, it was immediately obvious that Shida's room had not been untouched since they left. The familiar Dunama-style furniture was still in its place, but it had clearly been opened and used recently. The door to one of the closets stood open. The bed wasn't made. Even some of the clothes they had come here to get had been taken out of it, now lying on the bed like someone had left them there after doing whatever with them. This is kind of weird, right? Tuya asked, as the humans slowly flooded into the room. Did you mean creepy as hell? Admir asked in return, looking at the crumpled clothes laying on the bed. Because, in that case, yeah. Shida was almost as confused as they were, but more importantly, she was pretty pissed. To find this room that was so unbelievably familiar to her in such a violated state, it honestly ticked her off. Quickly, she stomped through the room, picking up all the strewn about clothes and stuffing them away into a bag of her own. All the while, the memories of the countless days and nights she had spent here played through her mind, endlessly repeating her daily routine that she had followed for years and years. Let's stop by the bridge, she more ordered than suggested, while stomping past everybody, and it seemed that nobody really wanted to contradict her on that. Instead, they all just shrugged and followed along. On her way, Shida made a slight detour to the laboratories and the research wing. She ignored the door to James's lab, not wanting to unnecessarily be confronted with any more memories. However, she did stop at another door. One that was crumpled and broken and cruelly bent back into shape after being blown out of its frame. Curie's lab was indeed still in disrepair, although the door was no longer guarded. At her behest, the door even opened without any need for further prompting. It groaned and protested as its malformed shape was forced to execute its original task, that it clearly wasn't 100% fit for anymore. Slowly, a thin layer of sight spread into the room, as a ray of light got wider and wider, illuminating the inside of the laboratory bit by bit. Shida remembered being on the other side of this door, witnessing this exact same phenomenon. Back then it had been terrifying. Now it was simply an annoyance as it wasted some time. Everyone else had caught up to her once the door had fully opened, allowing them to see the inside. The walls and floor inside the laboratory were still dented and blackened by flame. Soot still covered most of the surfaces, and the massive hole in the floor where fire had burned away at the metal was also still there. But apart from that, the lab was empty. No trace remained of the equipment stored in there. Not a hint of the experiment that had been sabotaged to cause the explosion. Everything had been disposed of. Sam whistled through her teeth. "And Curie really survived whatever caused all of this?" she asked, almost unbelievingly. "Damn." "Yeah, remind me not to get on their bad side," Amber concurred with her assessment of the situation. She'd almost laughed at that. Did Curie even have a bad side? But, looking back at this now, even after everything that happened, she herself was still slightly shocked as well. Such destruction for one person. And the captain said he didn't want any of this. If he was to be believed, and Shida felt that he was in this case, that meant someone had overruled him and ordered this attempt at the cyborg's life. So far, she had mostly just taken that as a fact, one of the many moving parts in this confusing puzzle. But now, after she had had time to let it sink in and was able to look back at it with some added context and experience, she had to wonder why. Even in the twisted minds of the hateful, what would justify all of this? Whatever the answers may have been, she wouldn't find them here anymore. This place was just an empty hull now. Both its mysteries and its occupant had left it behind to decay. Then the sound of something vibrating pierced the silence, and James looked down at his phone. "Looks like Curie and Moore don't need anything from here," he mumbled. Shida nodded, feeling that that was the jolt she needed to tear herself loose. "Then let's go," she said, proceeding further towards the bridge. As everyone followed, James briefly looked back. "Wish I could take my rats along."